Today, we are going to be looking at a passage from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. And maybe sometime we'll go all the way through the Sermon on the Mount. It's just such an amazing message. But today we're going to look at just a few verses and kind of key in on these, and then we'll draw on a few larger themes from the Sermon on the Mount. But just to get you a setting before we look at the verses in Matthew 5, just kind of remind you what is going on here in this sermon. So Jesus has been teaching and preaching throughout Galilee, up into Syria, it says. He's been going around to synagogues. He's been teaching, healing on the Sabbath, stirring up a bunch of trouble. And then at the very end of Matthew chapter 4, it kind of gives a summary of what leads to this crowd of people being there to listen to him. So I'm starting here in Matthew 4, verse 23, and it says, "And Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease among the people. Then his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torment, and those who were demon-possessed and epileptics and paralytics, and he healed them. And great multitudes followed him from Galilee, from Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan." So Jesus is going around, and not only is he teaching, but he's healing, and it's getting a lot of attention. You can imagine, especially in that day and age when there's not a hospital, doctors were viewed, rightly so, with suspicion, and there is someone who, just by his words, just by his touch, blind are seeing, the lame are walking, people who are possessed are being set free, and everybody is gathering around, and they are following Jesus. He's drawn a crowd. We know that where he is at now, where this large gathering is, it's right by the Sea of Galilee. It's on a hillside, a sloped hillside. I actually had the opportunity to go there a number of years ago. This is a picture I took in that place. It's just a very beautiful spot, kind of this grassy area. There's a lot of date farms and other things around overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And what's really interesting about this spot is that it kind of makes this natural little amphitheater where you could have 5,000 people gathered together, and one person could talk to them, and without any microphone or anything, they would easily be able to hear. So you've got this crowd of people. You've got this new teacher, this rabbi who everybody seems to be interested in. He's this miracle worker. But notice who is there. People who've had broken bodies, broken minds. In Luke, if you read his account, it's very clear that the poor are there. The people who are maybe been pushed out on the fringes of society. And they have all come to hear him, to find him, to see him, to be healed by him, to follow him. And so Jesus begins teaching. The first part here in Matthew 5 is the Beatitudes. We'll maybe talk about those just a little bit here later on. But blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and so on. These sayings that seem so simple, but were so different than what those who were there would have expected. And then we get to verses 13 to 16. And Jesus starts out by saying, "You are the salt of the earth." Now, he's talking. Remember who he's talking to. Broken bodies, broken minds, the poor. He tells them, "You are the salt of the earth." And he's going to tell them, "You are the light of the world." Now, in our modern age, here in 2022, salt and light are probably things that you and I mostly take for granted. I mean, you just got to pour it out of the shaker, right? And probably it comes so easily to you, salt, that you actually have to watch and make sure that you don't get too much of it, right? And light, I mean, you just push a button, flick a switch. You've got all the light you could ever want. In fact, we have so much light, we have light pollution at night. And yet, Jesus is not speaking here in Matthew 5 to people living in 2022. This is people living 2,000 years ago. And at that time, we need to kind of understand why salt was significant. How they would have thought of salt. Not just this kind of dangerous thing you need to not eat too much of. Well, what does salt do? Why do we have salt? What do we like about it? Okay, it flavors things. It makes food salty. It brings out flavor. Some of you who like salty food, I mean, those chips, right? If you don't have the salt on them, they just don't quite taste the same. So it brings out flavor. But there are other spices. Jesus doesn't say, you are the basil of the earth, or, why does he hone in here on salt? What else does salt do? It's a preservative. So, 2,000 years ago, no refrigeration. If you're going to preserve meat, salt is the way that you would do it. In fact, there by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus has just called some fishermen to come follow him. Come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. And the way that they were able to have a profitable living is not just by catching fish and selling to those locally, but those fish would be caught and dried and salted, and now you have a durable food that can be traded over long distances. And the whole industry there on the Sea of Galilee was based on this fact. Now, salt, not only is it a seasoning, but also it's a preservative. It was very important in that day and age to preserve food. And it's also actually necessary for life. You can't live without salt. Now, they wouldn't do this today, but back in either the 20s or 30s, there was a doctor who wanted to experiment and see what would happen to people if they didn't have any salt. So Dr. Robert McCants, Cambridge University, found 4 volunteers, and I don't know how he inspired them to sign up, but 4 volunteers. He made them exercise until they sweated out all the salt in their bodies. And then for the next 10 days, he gave them food that contained 0 salt. Sounds fun, huh? So what happens at the end of 10 days when your body has no salt? Well, so the first thing that they noticed was after a little bit, they could not taste their food anymore. It wasn't just that they weren't eating food that wasn't salted, but they couldn't actually taste the other flavors. Food was all dull and extremely bland to them. And then, as their cells were not able to control the amount of water in them, salt is used in that process, they became extremely sluggish and extremely tired, to the point where they didn't even feel motivated to eat at all. So, after this 10 days, their body and cells was experiencing some edema and swelling. They can't taste anything. They're extremely exhausted and tired. I experienced some sort of seizures. And then at the end of the 10 days, he starts feeding them salt again. And very quickly, all of these symptoms reversed. And they were functioning normally again. Now, we wouldn't be allowed to do an experiment like that today, but salt is necessary for survival. In the ancient world, they knew this. In fact, salt was seen as a valuable commodity. The Romans, at one point in time, would pay their soldiers a salary, not in money, but in salt. And if they were worth their salt, they got their salt. There were whole trades and cities that were based just on the transaction, the trading of salt. Now, salt in many places was so scarce that they would actually trade ounce for ounce gold for salt. Can you imagine? But that wasn't the case in Israel. Because right next to Jerusalem, a few miles, you keep going down, 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 you get to the Dead Sea, or the Sea of Salt. Abundance of salt. And there was a whole mining and trade industry that was there at the Dead Sea that allowed them to collect this salt and then to trade it as a valuable commodity all around. So when Jesus is telling his followers that they are the salt of the earth, they have all this in mind, right? This is what he says. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. So salt enhances flavor, it preserves things, and ultimately it's necessary for life. And he's saying, you guys are the salt of the earth. Now, what would life be like without salt? It'd be sad. And eventually there wouldn't be life, right? He said, you guys are necessary for the earth. You are the salt of the earth. And you can think about how this may work. As Christians, is there something that we, by our presence in society, can preserve? I think yes. Is there elements of goodness and truth and morality that by our presence in society we can preserve so that it doesn't disappear, so that it doesn't rot away and corrupt? Is there a flavor or an enhancement to the world around us that we can bring? And is there life that our presence can bring into the people and the communities around us? So he says, we are the salt of the earth. But notice the warning. If salt loses its flavor. Now in the Greek it's really interesting. It says, if salt becomes foolish. If salt becomes foolish. So if you had some salt that wasn't salty, how valuable would that be to you? What would you do with it? You'd throw it away, right? I mean, if salt isn't salty, what is it? Now, actually, in fact, salt actually can't lose its flavor. You put salt in a jar, put it on the shelf, you were to fast forward time for a couple thousand years, you come back, still salty, right? But in Jesus' day, as they were gathering salt from the Dead Sea and other places, they're not just getting salt, but they're also getting other minerals. There's maybe some sediment mixed in there. And if this is all piled up someplace to be traded, and it's rained on enough, what happens? The salt leaches out, and what you have left over, it might look like salt, it might be kind of whitish, but it's actually not even salt. It's sediments and other minerals, and it's not going to taste very good, and it's not going to preserve things, And the only good thing that it is just to throw it out. Throw it on the path. Keep from slipping or whatever. But it's not good for anything else. Salt's purpose is to be salty. Okay. So let's keep going here. Jesus says not only are we the salt of the earth, but we are also the light of the world. And what does light do? It illuminates the darkness. It allows us to see and be aware and function in the world around us. Can you imagine a world without light? Now think about what Jesus is saying here. He's talking to very common, ordinary people with problems and difficulties. These aren't the teachers. These aren't the elect. These aren't our elite. He's saying, you, common, everyday people who've chosen to follow me, you, the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. Can you imagine a world without light? It'd be not only different, but eventually all life's going to die, right? We receive not only the ability to see through light, but life itself is sustained by light. So he says, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. So just like the salt that loses its saltiness, what good is it? A light that doesn't shine, what good is it? I mean, that's its whole purpose, right? If you've got a lamp and you hide it under a basket, what's the point in having the lamp? It doesn't fulfill its ultimate purpose. Now it's interesting, Jesus uses two examples here. One of the salt losing its saltiness, it becomes less distinct, right? It kind of blends in and disappears. It assimilates. And then what's the point of it? It's not distinct from anything around it. And then, the light that is under the basket, it doesn't assimilate, it like quarantines itself. It's separate. It's not diffused. And I believe those are two of the most serious temptations to Christians today. One, we can blend in and assimilate so we're not distinct, so we're just like everything around us. And then what's the point? What's the purpose? Or we can separate. So we're distinct, but we're not diffused. We're not anywhere that does anybody any good. We're separate and quarantined and cloistered. And then what is the purpose? Salt and light, to do any good, have to be spread out, right? You got to get it out of the jar, the shaker, and put it on your food. The light has to be able to shine in order to do good. And ultimately, I think Jesus is saying that if we are going to be salt and light, we have to not only not assimilate, we have to be distinct, we have to have something of value and worth, some goodness that we bring, but we also can't be separate. We have to be spread out. We have to be diffused. If the only people that we interact with are other Christians, where's our salt? It's stuck in the shaker, right? How's it going to flavor anything? How's it going to season anything? How's it going to preserve anything? If the only people that we hang out with are like us, and they know Jesus, where's our light? It's under a basket. Now, it's wonderful to be part of a community. It's wonderful to have Christian friends and brothers and sisters, to have close connections. But if that's all we have, we cannot be the salt of the earth. We're just salt. And we cannot be the light of the world. We're just light, off in a corner under some basket. And it's not doing any good. If we're to be salt of the earth, light of the world, we have to have contact with those who don't know Jesus. And in our busy day, our busy age, if we're honest, that takes some intentionality. Because life is busy. There's things to do. There's responsibilities. And it can go by in just such a flash. And we spent our life separate from those that we're meant to be salt and light to. All right. Notice the next verse here. So let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Notice the point. Let your light so shine before men that people are going to see something in you that is different, and that something that is different is going to cause them to glorify God. Say, wow, if God is anything like that, if He's patient or kind or considerate, or if He listens or cares like that, anything like that, then He must be good. They see something in you that causes them to glorify God. Now, this is very different from doing good works so that they glorify you. In fact, Jesus talks about that just in a little bit later in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, when you pray, don't go out to the street corner and pray so everybody can see you and say, oh man, look at that man of prayer. Look at that woman of prayer. Go to your closet. And when you give money, don't do it so that everybody sees. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand know what your right hand is doing. When Jesus says, so let your light shine before men, He's saying we need to be spread out, salt of the earth, light of the world, so that ultimately the attention is not on us, but it is on God. The focus is on Him. And by the way, that makes sense, right? I mean, when you go over to Mark's house and he cooks you some food, and you take a bite, you don't say, man, Mark, you've got some good salt. Your salt is just so amazing. I can't get over this salt. Is that what you're thinking about? The salt's in there. It's enhancing the flavor. But it's not the focus. When you turn on the light, are you just staring at the light? The light illuminates other things. That's its purpose. We don't turn on lights just to stare at lights. We turn on lights so that we can see other things. So let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So ultimately, the focus, the attention is not on us, but is on God. Okay, so we're supposed to be salt of the earth, light of the world. We've got to have contact. We've got to be spread out of the salt shaker, out from underneath the basket. But how do we be salt? How are we light? I mean, does Jesus really want me to be salty? I thought it was salty enough, right? How are we salt? Well, I think he makes it pretty clear that they may see your what? Your good works. The Greek here, it's interesting, the word good, there's two different words that they could have used. One could be good like in like it's of a good quality. But really, the word here that's translated good, is more like beautiful. Something that is beautiful to look at or behold. That they may see your beautiful works, your beautiful life, and glorify your Father in heaven. What does that look like? I think here in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives us a picture. He gives us these fragments that if we put them together like a stained glass window, we can see a picture of that good life, that beautiful life, that life that is salt of the earth and light of the world. And so I want to just very quickly go through just a short survey, some of these shapes of glass in this stained glass window here in the Sermon on the Mount. And as we put these together, hopefully you can see a picture that comes into focus. Matthew 3, 1-12, the Beatitudes. Sorry, Matthew 5, 3-12, yes. Thank you. Think about this in terms of what that good life, those good works, that beautiful life looks like. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, so they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now there's a lot in there we could talk about, but I want you to start to get a picture of the life that is salt and light. Are they haughty in spirit? Poor in spirit, meek. What happens to their hearts when they see unrighteousness around them? They mourn. They long for righteousness. They hunger and thirst for goodness. Now, when you hunger and thirst for something, is it something you have? Something you desire and long. And when you hunger, is that a good feeling? When you thirst, is that something that you like to feel? No. It's painful in a sense. These are people who are looking at the state of the world around them, looking at how people treat other people, and they're hungering and thirsting for there to be righteousness, for there to be justice and kindness and peace and love. They are merciful. They are pure in heart. They are peacemakers. That's not always an easy calling, is it? Because if somebody's making peace, it means there's war, there's a fight. And who wants to step in the middle of that? Because the truth is, you know how it is. If you're a peacemaker and you're not just siding with one or the other, oh man, you're likely to make yourself two enemies. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Okay, let's go down just a little bit. So Jesus goes on here in Matthew 5. He talks about the law, how he came to fulfill the law. And he keeps going through this series of, you heard that it was said, but I tell you. You've heard that it was said, don't murder. I tell you, don't even be angry in your heart. You've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery. I tell you, don't look at a woman lustfully. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and so forth. Notice verse 43. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. By the way, how much of the world if we were honest, subscribes to this philosophy right here. If we were absolutely honest. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Have you ever thought about how yeah. Have you ever thought about how in the movies, when the bad guy is defeated, maybe he's killed at the end by the superhero, what does everybody in the movie theater do? They clap, they rejoice, because their enemy has been killed. Is that the way that God works? You know what he says in Ezekiel? I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. He's not loving his neighbor and hating his enemy. He's loving his neighbor and even loving his enemy. That's why Jesus on the cross. Father, forgive them. All right, verse 43. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends the rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore, you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So what does a life look like that's lived like this? Somebody who truly loves those who persecute them and curse them and spitefully use them. Go down with me to chapter 7. Judge not, that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with what measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite! First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, those of you who are married, you know it's so much easier to see that little speck in your spouse's eye than that log sticking out of your own, right? And it's not just true in marriage, it's true in humans in general. Can't we see with such pinpoint accuracy the faults of those around us? And aren't we so blind to our own character faults and deficiencies? And Jesus says, because of this, because you actually can't see, because your own problems actually blind you to your faults, work on yourself. Grow, work on your problems before you ever try to reach out and take something out of somebody else's eye. Judge not. Now, how different would the world be if this is the way everybody operated? If this is the way we interacted with one another? If this is the way that spouses and employers and friends, we all, enemies, neighbors, treated one another? So we could go on. There's many other shapes that we could add to that stained glass window here in the Sermon on the Mount. But I hope that you're beginning to see that the way that Jesus is calling us to be salt and light is not just to refrain from doing evil, forbidden things. He's calling us to be a different sort of presence, a different sort of person, a different sort of influence in the world that works in a almost opposite trajectory than the one that the world is on. that uses very different sorts of principles. And by the way, if we're to take this picture here that we see through all these pieces on the Sermon on the Mount, we're to put all those shapes together in a stained glass window, what do we see? What's the ultimate image that is revealed? Isn't it Jesus? I mean, think about it. Somebody who is meek and merciful. Somebody who blesses those who persecute them. Somebody who loves their enemies. Somebody who does not judge. Everything here is a description of Jesus. It is all Him. It's all pointing toward Him. Which, by the way, is why He says, John 8 and other places, I am the light of the world. He is ultimately the light. He's the salt. But He's not here walking around right now. We are. But hopefully, prayerfully, He is in us, living out a life, doing the same sorts of things He did while He was here 2,000 years ago in person. He's doing those same sorts of things in your neighborhood, at your job, in your home, and in mine. That His presence in us is salt and light to the whole world. I want to just end with this final thought. There are many days that I don't feel like salt. And I don't feel like light. And the truth is that I'm right. There's many days that my influence is not one that it should be. There are many days that maybe my light is under a bushel. But ultimately, I think we need to remember that our light is borrowed. Think about the moon. How bright is the moon? Remember in Guyana, we had when I was a student missionary there, in our village there's no electricity, no light at night. You save batteries for only emergencies, right, in your flashlight, because they're expensive and they might not have them on the one shelf in the store there in town. And so when I'd walk on the trail at night, I always hoped that the moon would be out. Either it would be, not a new moon, or there wouldn't be clouds. Because if the moon was out, I could see. It was bright. I could see everything around. But if the moon was gone, it would be so pitch black you couldn't see right in front of you. It was just darkness. But with the moon, there was enough light. Now, it's not like the daytime, but it was enough. Now, if you were to get in a spaceship and fly to the moon, you arrive there, and you don't go to the front side, you go to the back side of the moon. How bright is the moon, actually? Do you know what color moon rocks are? Have you ever seen them? They are dark gray. They're not white and bright. They are like dark gray. The moon is not bright. It has zero light of its own. But in the night, it shines so brightly because the sun is shining on it. and then it gives its light. It just borrows the sunlight and passes on. So if we want to be light, we don't muster it. We don't create it. We don't manufacture it. We look to Jesus. Focus on Him. Focus on His goodness and His light. And allow His light to penetrate us. And then eventually some of it's going to start bouncing off and reaching other people.